I remember years in the 2010s where I'd really have to think about which amazing movie I would sadly have to leave off a best of the year list. In 2018, all the way down to like number 18, you'd still be seeing 8 out of 10s or higher. And movies from this year I gave ratings that high are Titan and Dune. I watch a lot of great movies, and I watch them often, but looking at my videos, I don't think you'd get that impression. I like digging my heels into exposing the newest piece of garbage, cause most of the time they deserve it, but I think it's best to have reminders every now and again that I do this because I watch tons of great movies. I just don't talk about them. First new movie I watched this year was a 10, Dancer in the Dark. Instantly one of my favorite movies. It'll rip your heart to shreds, and then bam, Amelie will put it back together because it is also a perfect 10. I made a video talking about how much I love Suspiria, but then I saw the Three Colors trilogy, then Eraserhead, The Red Shoes, bam 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 bra bra bra. All these incredible movies I'm seeing for the first time. But not a single movie in years have I loved as much as Come and See, and I want to talk about why. It is absolutely flawless. A lot of time has passed between when I last reconsidered what my favorite movie of all time is and present day, and after some thought, it might be Come and See. It is that good. The kind of film where I'd feel guilty even if I gave it a 10, because I've given that same rating to movies that are so much worse. Come and See follows a 14-year-old boy named Floria living in Belarus as he leaves his village to join the army during World War II, and the ensuing carnage grows into an absolutely soul-destroying nightmare. The director is a man named Elem Klimov, and he was to make a film commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Allies' great victory in Europe. Wanting to create the most naturalistic and real story possible, almost the entire movie is based on events which actually took place. Klimov saw inspiration from first-hand accounts of fascist atrocities recorded in the book I Am From the Fiery Village, as well as the lived resistance fighter experience of a teenage Ales Adamovich, the film's co-writer. Everything in this movie happened. The screenplay was rejected time and time again by the USSR Cinematography Committee because they deemed it too upsetting and realistic. And if this is the movie we got, I can't imagine what was in the older drafts. The film begins with Floria excavating a rifle out of an abandoned battlefield. He is then conscripted into the partisan army under Commander Cossack, a man who supposedly cries at night from what he's seen in battle, but due to his outward stoicism, Floria rejects this prospect. He meets a girl named Glasha before escaping an attack by German dive bombers and decides to return to his village with her. There he finds his home deserted, believing the villagers have retreated into a nearby bog. But as he and Glasha run away, she looks over her shoulder, finding the villagers' massacred bodies in a heap outside a house. Retreating to the bog, the two essentially lose their minds, realizing the villagers' fate. A starving group of refugee fighters take them in, sending Floria and a small group of men to find food. Their attempts all go horribly wrong, as a warehouse they were set on raiding turns out to be guarded by German troops. Half of their team dies in a minefield, and even when they successfully steal a cow from a farmer, they get caught in the crossfire of German and resistance soldiers, leaving Floria the lone survivor, including the cow. The next morning, Floria wanders to the nearby village as an SS unit approaches it. A stranger helps him hide his identity and conceal his rifle in the fields, but in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't mean much. This is where all hell breaks loose. The Germans round up the occupied villagers and herd them into a barn. In a seemingly uncharacteristic act of mercy, one officer cries out that while children must stay inside, a select few may exit through the window, an opportunity which Floria takes. The Germans proceed to set the building on fire, and the film becomes unadulterated pandemonium. In real time, we watch them slaughter the trapped peasants and sack the village. Amidst the chaos, a few officers hold Floria hostage, pointing a gun at his head for a photo op, leaving him to collapse from exhaustion as they continue ravaging the area. Floria, looking absolutely gaunt, awakens, retrieves his rifle from the field, and finds Commander Kosak's battalion has captured 11 German soldiers and officers, including a particularly fanatical man who Floria recognizes as the officer who said children must stay inside the barn, knowing they'd be slaughtered. While Cossack plans to have them burned to death, the crowd of partisans is a bit less patient and shoot the Nazis prematurely. As Floria prepares to leave with the partisans, we arrive at the film's oft-discussed perplexing conclusion. He and a new recruit find a portrait of Hitler left behind in a puddle. In a truly deranged show of anger and trauma, Floria proceeds to shoot it, triggering a montage of reversed Nazi propaganda footage. The clips move faster and faster before pausing on a painting of a mother with a baby seated on her lap. The baby, of course, being Adolf Hitler. Despite everything he's been through and all Hitler did, Floria hesitates to shoot again, to which he weeps and falls back in line with the partisans as the camera wanders through the forest, losing sight of him as the army marches on. Come and See's depiction of war and the brutality within it is the part of the film which is most immediately noticeable. At a glance, that's all it has to offer. But this is something I heavily disagree with. Klimov is not appealing to fetishized misery with the film's pacing and structure as my evidence. It doesn't immediately throw down the pedal and become as graphic as it can. The film's monstrous climax exists so you may understand why it's structured this way in retrospect. The burning of the village is definitely horrifying, but so is connecting the symbolic dots of Floria's journey across the film that led him here. Floria begins his story an incredibly naive character. He has a simple understanding of war and an idealized version of fighting in the resistance. It's what prods him to go digging and find his rifle despite the village elder telling him not to. In small doses, though, he begins to see that image of going to war not really matching what he had in his head, though it begins with small things like being forced to give up his good boots or cleaning out this giant soup basin. But he holds fast to his pride as a soldier.
Дура! У меня 60 патронов! Граната! Винтовка самозарядная! Я воевать сюда пришел! А вы меня за придурка держите!
It's not until he finds his village slaughtered Floria has to confront his notion of war. There is no other way than bone-chilling to describe the sequence leading to discovering the pile of bodies. The pacing and silence speak at the loudest volume possible. At once, Floria must face both the loss of all those close to him and the all-too-common innocent casualties of warfare. The first significant illusion that breaks for him is that war is something people sign up for. While ignorant, Floria's desire to do what seems right in the midst of the film's bloodshed makes him easy to empathize with, but on paper, he is a meaningless, inconsequential protagonist. In another script, it might be easy to wave off his character as poorly written because, given how put upon he is, you'd sympathize with anybody in his situation. However, this couldn't be any further from the truth, because this is exactly why the film works. At a glance, Come and See is a brutal, realist depiction of war, and it is, but it is also a story of an individual, Floria, overestimating his place and what he can take into his own hands within such conflict, his signature character flaw. He is only put upon so much because that sequentially adds to what he feels personally responsible for. When he returns home, not only does he find his family dead, but the resistance fighters in the bog have rescued the village elder, heavily burnt but still alive. And he says, "Didn't I tell you not to dig?" What I've yet to tell you so far is we're briefly shown a spy plane flying overhead in the opening scene where Floria finds his rifle. And with this rebuke from the elder, Floria connects the dots in his head that this plane saw him holding the gun and reported a resistance fighter in the area, making the village massacre his fault. His fantasies of war-born glory directly begot these dire consequences others were made to suffer. The film simply does not let up either. These incredibly traumatic moments, they come, they go, and Floria is forced into the next impossibly harsh chapter of his story as the trauma compounds. Suddenly, he is now responsible for the survival of the starving refugees, another opportunity to give himself purpose. But then this fails as well. No image represents come and see greater than Floria hopelessly trying to drag the dead cow on his own because he can't think of anything else to do. This scene, to me, says it all. Then he is forced to deal with the hell on earth that comprises the rest of the film amidst already having to worry about failing to provide for the refugees. It's not just that a barn of innocent people are burned to death, it's that such an act of dehumanizing violence is the capstone to a child's journey learning the truth. That against oppression and war, nothing can be taken into the hands of an individual. This film occupies a strange place in film culture. The average person, I think, has no idea what it is if you ask them, but most film buffs know about it. They'll say Come and See is a story of lost innocence, as it makes a lingering point juxtaposing Floria at the beginning and end of the film. But like people's fixation on the brutality, that's unintentionally reductive, as several other war movies you could say are about lost innocence. I think this description fails to properly surmise the story and what sets Come and See apart. Francois Truffaut once said there's no such thing as an anti-war film. He believed there was no way to depict it without silently condoning it at the same time, and in most cases, I would agree with him. In Hollywood at least, especially because every movie depicting war has to pass through the approval of the Pentagon, you're never gonna see a film with a truly critical image of the US military. Even American films which appear anti-war are secretly about individual honor superseding the darkness and corruption which surrounds the characters, priming you to accept the fantasy of patriotic individualism. The difference between a war film and a true anti-war film like Come and See is, there is no heroism. There is no virtue in Floria's suffering, because the only real truth of war as an entity and vehicle for dehumanization is cold, relentless indifference. This makes Come and See inaccessible to many at first, before its intentions are understood. In opposition to this obsession with glitz and prestige, not a single commercial element of traditional war movies is utilized here. There is zero gloss or fantasy in its presentation that's so common elsewhere. Floria's dead family is unceremoniously shown in like one shot as Glasha glances over her shoulder. Instead of a traditional film score, the sound design is full of diegetic noise. Whenever audio is added, it sounds like we fell backwards into Silent Hill. And it always creeps up on the viewer rather than announce its presence loudly. The film keeping itself at such an arm's length from any overt signs of empathy or malice is how, despite the realism it's going for, it simultaneously borders on what we would interpret as surrealism. But as I said, there is no dramatized gloss of American cinema here, as Klimov's goal was being as naturalistic as he could. Come and See is a very rare type of film which feels as though you're just witnessing events as they happen. So sure, almost everything is captured as it was without manipulated sets, lighting, and unrealistic angles, and not to understate any of that's importance in the realism, but he took it even several steps further. Floria, for example, was deliberately not played by a professional actor, because an actor would have a natural psychological distance from what he'd be asked to perform. In a sense, Alexei Kravchenko was going to experience exactly what Floria would for the part of his life captured in the film. Klimov knew this could possibly be damaging to Alexei's sanity, as much of his stress, hunger, and fatigue would be real. Just as Floria would come to realize what true hatred and despair is, so would Alexei. But the harrowing nature of the film had to be uncompromising, so even if it took Klimov hiring a hypnotist and personally keeping in touch with Alexei after filming to make sure he didn't go insane, that would be preserved. And at the end of all of this, Alexei's performance is better than I don't know how many people paid millions of dollars to fuck around on screen and call it art. because Klimov knew what he was doing and exactly why he was doing it. The munitions, weapons, and stunts were all real as well, so in this take of Floria and Glasha running as bombs are being dropped on them, those are real explosions happening where the actors were standing mere seconds ago, and real bullets were whizzing past the actors' heads in scenes like this. You can argue whether or not this is safe, and it isn't, but the movie came out in the 1980s, and I'm not gonna wag my finger at a Russian guy who's been dead for over a decade. There are obvious lines that can't be crossed, like you clearly wouldn't burn a man to death just to make a movie. However, the film feels so real in every other area, those parts fit right snugly into my suspension of disbelief. Also, just how long shots will last sometimes really contributes to the realism as well. This one shot begins with a character running hundreds of feet from the tree line and follows him the entire way there. The long take of Floria and Glasha crossing the bog is the perfect accent to them just discovering the dead villagers. It's like a Renaissance depiction of hell. If you really look at the cinematography, count the number of shots which capture something a character in that scene could not visibly see themselves. I would wager that number is frighteningly low. There is no frame of come and see which would be implausible for you to experience yourself, often utilizing close-ups of characters looking directly into the camera as if to actively confront the viewer and add to the dreamlike quality of the film. See, Come and See's brilliant filmmaking is deceptively complex. It is not the most beautifully shot film ever made. It is not the best edited movie ever made. But it utilizes those things for its intended purpose better than most other films ever do. Come and See finds its title from the book of Revelations in the Bible, wherein John states, "And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, 'Come and see.' And I looked and beheld a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him." To me, this suggests the story is set on depicting Klimov's impression of a great cataclysm, the undoing of the world and humanity. The film is an invitation to witness not only a physical war, but a battle for the human soul. So if Klimov's presenting a metaphysical battle, then who emerges victorious? Well, much like another biblical story, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the soul becomes blemished in pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Characters seek and follow a compulsion to bear witness to the truth. By Floria giving up his unknowingness, he loses his childhood. When the SS officer says villagers may leave the barn, but the children have to stay, and then Floria is allowed to leave, it's a perfectly executed metaphor in the midst of the film's realism, because on an existential level, he is no longer unknowing, and therefore no longer a child. When reintroduced to Cossack's battalion, there has been a physical transformation to accompany his intangible one, as Floria is made to resemble an old man. At the outset, Floria doesn't understand how Cossack could cry, he seems so strong, but eventually sees it as the only course of action for a person familiar with war. He can't possibly not understand why. He's felt the indifferent, oppressive hand of war. An indifference which the populace is forced into lest they surrender to the Nazis and face annihilation. Surrounded by SS soldiers raising a village, the most attention anyone pays Floria is to hold a gun to his head for a photo opportunity. Whoever sees this picture in the future is gonna assume they shot him. It would have taken no effort, but the truth is he's worth less than even the millisecond and single bullet it would have taken to execute him. The film's weighty, realistic bleakness reaches an unnerving climax as footage of real Belarusian captives are shown, the film threatening to throw open the gates at the edge of cinematic fantasy. A note that over 600 villages were slaughtered in a way not unlike we've seen in the film is shown as well. Here at the end of Floria's descent into basically hell, it would seem Come and See's battle for the human soul has a victor. Or does it? Floria's clinging to personal responsibility symbolically begins and ends with this rifle he's excavated in order to join the partisans. It represents his initial view of war, his ability to make a difference. He goes nowhere without it and even uses scavenged medical supplies to mend it. All this for a gun he doesn't ever use. That is, until the end culminates in him hopelessly blasting the portrait of Hitler. each bullet furthering a reversed montage of destruction and propaganda, the entire weight of the war just bearing down on him. But when all that's left is baby Hitler, he stops. Still so desperate to feel like he could make a difference, Floria saw shooting a picture in a fit of maniacal anger as the last thing he could do to feel like he's taking the war into his own hands. His innate hesitation, that instinct to spare a defenseless child, is finally that little thing he's taken into his own hands. Despite the dehumanization and violence thrown at him, that littlest bit of humanity has still made itself evident, proving it didn't work completely. It's the last thing he can hold on to. This shit is fucking poetry, dude. Come and See is such a rarity among movies, if for no other reason than its pure honesty and genuine mournfulness. Showing true despair and going to places as Klimov does here is a true cinematic risk, but also a towering monument to the medium's potential. He literally stopped making movies afterwards because, according to him, there was nothing left he could do with the medium. And I don't disagree with him. Adamovich said of audiences perhaps being turned away by the darkness of the film, "Let them not watch it then, this is something we must leave after us, as evidence of war and as a plea for peace. Everything that burned inside of those involved to bring us this film is evident, clear as day, leaving no wonder as to why something like this absolutely had to be made. If you don't give this a 10, what more do you want? Literally, what more do you want? What else possibly could you be looking for?"